American Revolution, 1776. A nation on the brink. In the summer of 1776, the American Revolution was close to collapse. The British Empire sent its largest army ever across the Atlantic, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. Outnumbered and unprepared, George Washington's Continental Army faced disaster in New York. Defeat after defeat shattered morale, and many believed independence was already lost. By winter, the army was exhausted, divided, and barely holding together. The revolution stood at its darkest hour. Then, Washington made a desperate choice, one bold move that risked everything. It would either end the rebellion or change history forever.
The Giant Awakens. British logistics and the arrival of the fleet. The horizon of masts. The scale. The summer of 1776 did not bring warmth to New York. It brought a forest of oak and canvas. Imagine standing on the shores of Staten Island. Slowly, the horizon begins to disappear, replaced by the towering masts of the British Royal Navy. This was not just a fleet, it was a floating city of war. By July, over 400 ships had dropped anchor. To put this in perspective, this was the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever sent abroad in its history, a record that would stand until the world wars of the 20th century. Among them were 73 warships, bristling with thousands of cannons, and hundreds of transport ships carrying 32,000 professional soldiers. For the ragtag Continental Army watching from the shore, the sight was psychological warfare before a single shot was fired. The logistical colossus. Behind this spectacle was a feat of logistics that defied the technology of the 18th century. Britain was fighting a war 3,000 miles away from its base of supply. Every single bullet, every ounce of gunpowder, and every uniform had to survive a treacherous 2-month journey across the Atlantic. But it went deeper than ammunition. The British did not trust the American countryside to provide food. Consequently, they shipped thousands of tons of salt pork, hard biscuits, and even oats for their horses from London and Cork. The giant was awake, but it was a giant that required a massive, expensive umbilical cord stretching across the ocean. If that cord ever frayed, the empire would starve in the wilderness. The professional and the mercenary. The men stepping off those boats were the finest killing machine on the planet. These were the redcoats, men who had spent years mastering the manual of arms, capable of firing 3 aimed shots a minute under heavy fire. Accompanying them were the Hessians, nearly 9,000 elite German soldiers from Hesse Castle. Contrary to the myth that they were just mercenaries there for the money, these were state-sanctioned professionals, feared for their brutality and their 17-inch steel bayonets. They were the special forces of the 18th century, and they had been rented by King George III to ensure the American rebellion was crushed with absolute prejudice. Primary evidence. The terror of this arrival is preserved in the diaries of those who saw it. Daniel McCurtain, an American rifleman, wrote as he watched the ships enter the harbor, "I thought all London was afloat. I declare that all the Navy of Great Britain was at hand. The masts looked like a forest of tall pine trees." Even the British commanders felt the weight of their mission. General William Howe, commander of the land forces, knew that this was the Empire's one great shot. His orders were clear: capture New York, seize the Hudson River, and cut the colonies in half. The Continental contrast. While the British landed with fine porcelain, wine, and professional surgeons, Washington's army was a nightmare of disorder. Many of his 19,000 men were suffering from smallpox and dysentery. They were farmers, school teachers, and shopkeepers. Most had never seen a bayonet charge. As the British began their landing on Long Island, the message was clear to every man in the Continental Army. The time for politics was over. The British hadn't come to negotiate, they had come to conquer. The year of crisis had truly begun, and the American Revolution was now a fight for sheer survival.
The fog of war, the Battle of Long Island, and the miracle at Brooklyn. The trap is set. By late August 1776, the British giant finally moved. General William Howe landed 20,000 men at Gravesend Bay, Long Island. Washington, fearing a diversion, split his already smaller army between Manhattan and Brooklyn. It was a classic military error, splitting your forces in the face of a superior enemy. The Americans occupied the heights of Guan, a ridge of hills that acted as a natural wall. They guarded 3 main roads, believing they were secure, but they left one narrow, winding path unguarded, the Jamaica Pass. In a brilliant night march, guided by local loyalists, the British moved their entire strike force through this gap. By dawn, the Americans weren't just being attacked, they were being surrounded. The blood of the Maryland 400. As the British trap snapped shut, the American lines collapsed in terror. Panic-stricken soldiers fled into the Gowanus marshes, many drowning under the weight of their deer. But amidst this carnage, one of the most heroic and tragic stands in military history took place. Approximately 400 soldiers from Maryland, known as the Maryland 400, realized that if they didn't hold the line, the entire American army would be slaughtered. They charged a fortified stone house held by a massive British force, not once, but 6 times. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. As Washington watched from a distance through his telescope, he reportedly cried out in agony, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Out of the 400, only a handful survived. Their sacrifice bought Washington the minutes he needed to pull his remaining men back to the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. Back against the wall. The situation was now catastrophic. Washington was pinned against the East River with 9,000 demoralized troops. In front of him was the professional British Army, behind him a deep, turbulent river. The British began digging siege trenches. They weren't in a hurry. They knew Washington had nowhere to go. They were waiting for the wind to change so the Royal Navy could sail into the river and cut off any hope of escape. This was the moment the American Revolution almost ended. If the wind had stayed favorable for the British ships, Washington would have been captured, and the war would have lasted mere months. The Spy Master's Miracle. On the night of August 29th, Washington made a desperate decision, a total secret evacuation. To do this, he utilized his most trusted assets, the Marblehead Mariners from Massachusetts, a group of expert sailors, many of whom were black and Native American soldiers. To keep the British from noticing, Washington ordered campfire deception. He kept the fires burning bright and ordered his men to be silent, wrapping their oars in cloth to muffle the sound of the water. Even as the sun began to rise, half the army was still on the Brooklyn side. Then, what many historians call the miracle occurred. A thick, unnatural fog settled over Brooklyn. It was so dense that a man could not see 6 feet in front of him. Under the cover of this providential fog, the remaining troops slipped across the river. When the fog finally lifted and the British stormed the American lines, they found nothing. Not a single soldier, not a single scrap of equipment. Washington was the last man to step onto the final boat. Analysis of the win. While the Battle of Long Island was a humiliating tactical defeat, the retreat from Brooklyn was a strategic masterpiece. It was Washington's first major success as a spy master, using secrecy, silence, and environmental awareness to survive. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, who would later lead Washington's spy ring, wrote in his memoir, "The order for retreat was conducted with such secrecy that even the officers did not know the plan until it began. When the fog lifted, the enemy was so astonished they could not believe their eyes." Washington had lost the ground, but he had saved the cause. However, the crisis was far from over. New York was now a playground for the British, and the city was about to burn.
A city in flames, the Great Fire, and the Civil War within a revolution. The occupation of New York. Following the retreat from Brooklyn, Washington realized that Manhattan was a death trap. The British Navy controlled the surrounding waters, and the city was indefensible. By mid-September 1776, the British landed at Kip's Bay, and the Continental Army was forced to abandon the city entirely. New York City was now under British control, a status it would keep for the next 7 years. But as the British redcoats marched into the city to the cheers of local loyalists, a dark question loomed in the American camp. Should we burn New York to the ground so the enemy has no place to sleep? Washington initially favored burning it, but the Continental Congress strictly forbade it, hoping to preserve the city for the future. The Night of Terror. Despite the orders, fate, or perhaps a secret agent, had other plans. Shortly after midnight on September 21, 1776, a fire broke out at the Fighting Cock's Tavern near Whitehall Slip. It was a windy night, and the city was a tinderbox. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Because the American Army had taken most of the firefighting equipment with them during their retreat, the British and the remaining citizens were helpless. The fire roared through the narrow wooden streets, leaping from roof to roof. St. Paul's Chapel was saved only by the frantic efforts of a human chain passing buckets of water, but the majestic Trinity Church was not so lucky. Its great steeple became a pillar of fire before collapsing into the ruins. By morning, nearly 1/4 of New York City, roughly 500 buildings, lay in smoldering ash. The blame game and the noose. The British were convinced the fire was an act of American arsonist terrorism. British soldiers began rounding up anyone who looked suspicious. In the chaos, the divide between patriot and loyalist became a matter of life and death. It was during this week of fire and suspicion that a young American officer named Nathan Hale was captured. He wasn't a professional spy. He was a school teacher who had volunteered to go behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on the British positions in New York. On September 22nd, amidst the smoke of the burning city, he was led to the gallows without a trial. His final words became the heartbeat of the rebellion. "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." A city divided. To understand the year of crisis, one must understand that New York was a city of enemies. Unlike Boston, New York was a loyalist stronghold. Many wealthy merchants and ordinary citizens believed the revolution was a mistake. When the British took the city, thousands of Tories, loyalists, flocked to New York for protection. For the next 7 years, the city became a sanctuary for those loyal to King George III, while the surrounding countryside was controlled by patriot militias. This created a brutal no-man's land in places like Westchester County, where neighbors robbed, tortured, and murdered one another. This wasn't just a war against England, it was America's first civil war. Primary evidence. The horror of the fire is captured in the words of Isaac Bangs, an American officer who watched the blaze from the Hudson Highlands.
The fire appeared to be at several places at once. The light was so great that we could read a small print at the distance of 10 miles. It was a scene of such horror and confusion as cannot be described. For the British, the fire was a logistical disaster. They had captured a city, but they had no roofs to cover their heads. For Washington, the loss of New York and the execution of Nathan Hale marked the absolute low point of his military career. The year of crisis was turning into a year of total collapse.
The psychology of defeat, the breaking point, and the ghost of an army. The long retreat. By November 1776, the American Revolution was a trail of blood in the snow. After the loss of New York and the fall of Fort Washington, where 3,000 of his best troops were captured, George Washington began a desperate retreat across New Jersey. This wasn't a strategic maneuver, it was a flight for survival. The British, led by Lord Cornwallis, were so confident that they treated the pursuit like a fox hunt. The Continental Army was shrinking every mile. Men who had signed up for glory in the summer were now shivering in rags. The geography of the retreat through Newark, New Brunswick, and Princeton became a map of American failure. The collapse of the ranks. The crisis of 1776 was not just about lost territory, it was about the expiration of hope. Most American soldiers had signed enlistment contracts that ended on December 31st. As that date approached, the army began to evaporate. Mass desertion became an epidemic. Men simply walked away from their posts, heading home to their farms, believing the war was already lost. Washington wrote to his brother, John Augustine Washington, in a moment of rare, raw honesty. I think the game is pretty near up. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties and less means to extricate himself from them. At one point, Washington had nearly 20,000 men in New York. Now, as he crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, he had fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers left. The weight of the crown. We often see Washington as a statue, cold and stoic, but in the winter of 1776, he was a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He was plagued by insomnia and a crushing sense of guilt. He knew that if he failed, every man who followed him would be hunted as a traitor. The psychological pressure was immense. His own adjutant general, Joseph Reed, began writing secret letters to other generals, questioning Washington's competence. Washington accidentally intercepted one of these letters. To be betrayed by his closest aide while the British were at his heels was a blow more painful than any bullet. He felt isolated, doubted by his officers, and abandoned by his soldiers. The specter of the prison ships. The despair was fueled by the horrifying news coming out of New York. The 3,000 Americans captured at Fort Washington were being held in the hulls of decommissioned British warships in Wallabout Bay, the infamous HMS Jersey, or Hell as it was known. The conditions were beyond human description. 10 men died every night from smallpox, starvation, and filth. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves in the sand at low tide. This was the fate that awaited Washington's remaining men if they were captured. The psychology of defeat was a mixture of total exhaustion and the paralyzing fear of a slow, anonymous death in a British prison ship. The reality of this period is best captured by a young soldier named John Greenwood, who described the state of the army as they reached the banks of the Delaware. I was now a miserable, barefooted soldier. We were many of us without shoes, and our steps could be tracked by the blood left in the snow. Not a man among us believed we would see the spring. Washington stood on the Pennsylvania shore, looking back at the river. He was a general without an army,
a leader without a country. The British had already issued a general pardon to anyone who would lay down their arms and swear loyalty to the king. Thousands were taking the deal. The revolution was down to its final heartbeat. To save it, Washington realized he could no longer play by the rules of traditional warfare. He had to become a gambler. The power of the pen, the American crisis, and the fire of words. The intellectual vacuum. By December 1776, the American Revolution was suffering from a crisis of meaning. The soldiers were no longer fighting for a glorious new nation. They were fighting just to stay warm and alive. The Declaration of Independence felt like a distant, failed promise. In the freezing camps along the Delaware River, the silence was heavy with the sound of men planning their desertion. General Washington knew he was losing the war of the mind. He needed a way to remind his men why they were suffering. It was in this vacuum of despair that Thomas Paine, a man who had marched with the army during the retreat from New York, took a drumhead as a desk and began to write by the flickering light of a campfire. These are the times. Imagine the scene. A cold, biting wind whistles through the tattered tents of the Continental Army. Men with frostbitten feet are huddled together for warmth. Suddenly, an officer stands in the center of the camp, holding a freshly printed pamphlet. He begins to read aloud, his voice cutting through the winter air. The words were unlike anything the men had heard before. They weren't the dry, legalistic arguments of lawyers or politicians. They were raw, rhythmic, and revolutionary. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. For the soldiers in the mud, these words were a mirror. They didn't want to be summer soldiers. They wanted to be the ones who stood by it now. Why it worked. To a modern audience, a pamphlet might seem insignificant, but in 1776, this was the equivalent of a viral broadcast. Paine's genius was in his use of plain language. He spoke to the common man, not the elite. He framed the struggle not as a tax revolt, but as a cosmic battle between freedom and slavery under a common murderer, referring to King George III. He used religious imagery that resonated deeply with the soldiers, stating that God would not let a people perish who had sought so earnestly to avoid war. Most importantly, he acknowledged their suffering. By calling it a crisis, he gave their pain a noble purpose. He transformed their retreat from a defeat into a test of character. Washington immediately recognized the power of Paine's writing. He was so moved by the first installment of the American crisis that he issued a general order. The pamphlet was to be read aloud to every corporal's guard and every company in the army. Private Elisha Bostwick, who was present at one of these readings, later wrote in his memoirs about the change in the camp's atmosphere. The words seemed to kindle a fire within us. We felt as though we were no longer a retreating mob, but an army with a sacred mission. Our spirits, which had been as cold as the ice on the river, began to burn again. The shift in the tide. The power of the pen did something that Washington's sword could not do at that moment. It halted the mass desertions. It bought Washington time. The men whose enlistments were ending on December 31st began to look at each other differently. They began to wonder if perhaps one more fight was possible. Thomas Paine didn't provide shoes or blankets, but he provided the will to endure. With the Army's spirit revived by these words, Washington finally had the psychological foundation he needed to plan his most dangerous move yet. The pen had saved the spirit. Now the sword had to save the nation. The invisible war, intelligence, deception, and the shadow of the gamble. The General as Spymaster. By December 1776, George Washington had learned a bitter lesson from the defeat at New York. An army without eyes is an army that dies. He began to divert his limited resources into a secret network of informants. He realized that the British giant had a weakness. It was overconfident and relied on local intelligence that was often biased or false. Washington began to master the art of the double game. He didn't just want to know where the British were. He wanted the British to believe they knew exactly where he was, while he was actually somewhere else. This was the birth of American military intelligence, born out of the absolute necessity of the year of crisis. The John Honeyman myth versus reality. One of the most enduring stories of this period is that of John Honeyman, a Tory butcher and cattle driver who was supposedly a double agent for Washington. While historians debate the exact details, the tactical reality remains. Washington used fake deserters to feed the Hessians at Trenton specific misinformation. These agents allowed themselves to be captured by the Hessians. Under interrogation, they told the German commander, Colonel Johann Rall, exactly what he wanted to hear, that the American army was a broken, starving mob, incapable of crossing the river, and that Washington was planning to flee further south to Philadelphia. This intelligence reinforced Rall's contempt for the peasant rebels, leading him to ignore repeated warnings of an actual American advance. Deception in the camp. Deception was not just practiced on the enemy, it was practiced on Washington's own troops to prevent leaks. In the days leading up to the gamble, Washington kept his plans so secret that even his high-ranking officers were kept in the dark until the last possible moment. To the British observers across the river, the American camp looked like it was dying. Washington intentionally kept his movements disorganized during the day. He leaked rumors that he was fortifying Philadelphia. He was creating a mirror of despair, letting the enemy see exactly what they expected to see, a defeated leader preparing for a final surrender. This invisible war of shadows was the only thing protecting the Continental Army as they prepared their boats. The fatal letter. On the very night of the attack, the invisible war almost took a dark turn. A local loyalist discovered the American army was moving toward the river. He ran to Colonel Rall's headquarters and, unable to speak with the colonel, who was busy playing cards and drinking, he left a handwritten note. The note explicitly warned, "The rebels are coming." Rall, distracted and convinced by his own superior intelligence that the Americans were harmless, stuffed the note into his pocket without reading it. This is a primary example of confirmation bias in military history. Rall believed the misinformation so strongly that he ignored the truth when it was literally in his pocket. Washington's own words reveal his obsession with secrecy. In a letter to Colonel Elias Dayton, he wrote, "The necessity of procuring good intelligence is apparent and need not be further urged, for upon it our success depends. Everything, in a word, must be kept a profound secret." This was the invisible war in action. Washington had successfully blinded the British and deafened the Hessians. He had turned his weakness into a cloak. Now, with the enemy lulled into a false sense of security by his brilliant deceptions, he was ready to move from the shadows into the icy waters of the Delaware.
The crossing, the tactical reality of the Delaware, beyond the painting. We have all seen the famous painting of Washington standing heroically in a boat, but the reality was far more grimy and terrifying. The night of December 25, 1776 was not just cold, it was a meteorological nightmare. A nor'easter had blown in, bringing a mixture of snow, sleet, and freezing rain. The Delaware River was not a smooth sheet of water.
It was choked with massive ice cakes, huge, jagged slabs of ice floating downstream that could easily crush a wooden boat or decapitate a soldier if he fell overboard. The wind was so strong that it blew out the lanterns, leaving the men in near total darkness, guided only by the sound of the icy water crashing against the hulls. The logistics of the crossing. Washington did not use small rowboats for this mission. To move an army, he needed Durham boats, heavy, black-hulled freight vessels used for hauling iron ore. These boats were 40 to 60 feet long and required expert handling. The heroes of this night were the Marblehead Mariners under Colonel John Glover. These were professional fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, many of whom were African Americans and Native Americans. They were the only men capable of navigating the ice-choked rapids. They didn't row the boats in the traditional sense. They used long setting poles to push off the riverbed and fend off the lethal ice slabs. Washington's plan called for moving 2,400 men, 18 cannons, and dozens of horses across this chaos. The failure of the flanks. What most history books omit is that Washington's plan was actually failing. The crossing was supposed to be a three-pronged attack. Two other divisions of the American Army were supposed to cross the river further south to support Washington. However, the ice and the storm were so severe that both of those divisions gave up. They looked at the river and decided it was impossible. Washington was now alone. He was behind schedule by 3 hours, meaning his surprise attack would now happen in broad daylight. He had a choice: abort the mission and retreat, or push forward into a potential massacre. He chose to push forward. The march into the abyss. The sheer grit of the American soldier is recorded in the diary of an unnamed officer on Washington's staff. The night was as cold as I ever felt. The sleet cuts like a knife. I saw many men without shoes. Their feet were wrapped in rags, and the snow was tinged with the blood from their feet. But no one complained. We marched in a profound, deathly silence. Even Washington's password for the night reflected the gravity of the moment. The soldiers were told to whisper the words, "Win or death." It wasn't a slogan, it was the literal truth. If they failed at Trenton, there was no river to retreat across. They would win, or the American Revolution would end on the streets of a small New Jersey town. The shock of Trenton and the birth of a legend. The strike at dawn. At 8 a.m. on December 26, 1776, the town of Trenton was still asleep under a blanket of sleet. The Hessians, exhausted from weeks of constant patrolling in the previous night's holiday celebrations, were suddenly jolted awake by the crack of American rifles. Washington's plan was a classic pincer movement. From the north and west, his columns converged on the town. The Hessians tried to form their lines in the narrow streets, but American artillery, positioned by a young Alexander Hamilton, rained grape-shot down the main thoroughfares. The German soldiers, world-renowned for their discipline, found themselves trapped in a chaotic urban nightmare. Within 45 minutes, it was over. Nearly 900 Hessians surrendered. The invincible mercenaries have been broken by a mob of farmers. The tactical brilliance of Princeton. Trenton was a victory, but it was just one town. The real genius of Washington appeared a few days later. Lord Cornwallis, furious at the defeat, rushed south with 8,000 elite troops to bag the Fox. He trapped Washington against the Assunpink Creek, boasting, "We've got the old Fox safe now. We'll bag him in the morning." But Washington used his invisible war tactics one last time. He left a few men behind to keep the campfires burning and make digging sounds with shovels, tricking the British into thinking the army was still there. Meanwhile, in total silence, Washington marched his entire army around Cornwallis's flank in the middle of the night. By morning, he was at Princeton, smashing the British rear guard. This double strike, Trenton followed by Princeton, showed that Washington had evolved from a retreating general into a master of maneuver warfare. The global realization, the geopolitical shift. The news of 1776's ending hit Europe like a thunderbolt. Before Trenton, the world believed the American Revolution was a doomed experiment. The British government was already preparing the terms of surrender. However, when news reached Paris and London that a starving, shoeless army had captured nearly 1,000 professional soldiers, the narrative changed instantly. The French, who had been hesitant to help, began to see the Americans as a viable investment. The year of crisis had proven that the Americans didn't need to win every battle, they just needed to survive and strike at the right moment. The British realization was far darker. They weren't fighting a rebellion, they were fighting a nation that refused to die. The enemy's respect. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence comes from the British themselves. Colonel William Harcourt, a British cavalry officer, wrote home with a newfound sense of dread. The rebels now have become a formidable enemy. Though they have been defeated in almost every encounter, they rise again with a spirit that is truly astonishing. They are now led by a man who, if he lacks the formal education of our generals, possesses a genius for war that we have underestimated. Even more famously, the British historian Sir George Otto Trevelyan later noted that it may be doubted whether so small a number of men ever employed so short a space of time with greater and lasting effects upon the history of the world. Legacy. The crisis conquered. As the army settled into winter quarters at Morristown, the crisis of 1776 had been averted. The men whose enlistments were supposed to end on December 31st chose to stay. They were no longer just sunshine patriots, they were veterans of the darkest hour. Washington had saved the Revolution not with a grand conquest, but with a gamble in the dark. 1776 began with the threat of total annihilation and ended with the promise of a new world. The year of crisis was over, but the road to independence had only just begun. The old fox had not only survived, he had changed the course of human history.
Final reflections. The year 1776 began with a declaration of hope and ended with a miracle in the snow. It was a year that tested the very limits of human endurance and the fragility of an idea called liberty. While the fires of New York and the frozen banks of the Delaware have long since faded, the legacy of that crisis remains. It reminds us that even in the darkest hour, when defeat seems certain and hope is a fading whisper, the courage of a few can change the destiny of millions. George Washington and his ragtag army didn't just survive 1776, they redefined what it meant to be American. The crisis was conquered, but the long, bloody road to independence was only just beginning. If you found this deep dive into the year of crisis insightful, consider subscribing for more untold stories from the pages of history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of our past.